Alors, merci beaucoup tout le monde. I will be speaking in English, but my comprehension in French is good. So please feel free to share your questions and comments at the end in whatever language you're most comfortable. I also want to preface this by saying I've translated my slides into French, but with the aid of AI technology, which tends to translate English gender language into French sex language, which is precisely counter to the argument that I'm trying to make in this presentation. So I apologize in advance if there's any errors in that regard. I've done my best to correct that. And also, I also want to let you know that being an anthropologist, part of a very qualitative research team, a lot of our research data are narratives from people with experience of pain, either as people with lived experience or healthcare providers who treat them. And I've left their words in the original English because the meaning can really change if I translate it. Also, because their circumstances are complex in ways that you're going to see, some of these text excerpts, I'm afraid, are a bit long. So I will read them with you. I try not to have text-dense slides, but I haven't been able to avoid it at some points in this presentation. So without further ado, au-delà des différences entre les sexes, comprendre la douleur avec un regard sur le genre. So a bit of context for this presentation. It draws on a very long team-based research trajectory going back actually to 2014, and the makeup of this team has changed. This is the current structure of the team. The project lead, Fiona Webster, was perhaps going to be here. I was formerly a postdoc on this project, on the earlier iteration of the COPE project. I'm now a co-investigator. And so just to walk you through the data that I'm going to be talking about, COPE-1 was an institutional ethnography of chronic pain management in family medicine. And this was in the province of Ontario specifically, but an Ontario-wide study. And the key questions that we were exploring in COPE-1 were, how do primary care providers describe the work they do in caring for patients with complex chronic conditions, especially pain? And secondly, but just as important, how are complex patients defined and understood by primary care providers? So looking at issues of sex and gender wasn't an explicit focus of our research at that time. And the findings that we got through that study includes 61 in-depth interviews with healthcare providers, both pain specialists and family physicians, 5 interviews with medical students, 3 with patients, and more than 60 hours of ethnographic observations in primary care settings where people with chronic pain receive care. A little bit about what ethnography is for anyone here who is more quantitatively inclined. It's a research methodology that originates in anthropology, but is now widely used in health research more generally, and uses all the kind of standard qualitative tools that you're probably familiar with, like interviews and focus groups, but also observation. This is really a cornerstone of what ethnographic research entails. So the goal is to provide rich, in-depth exploration of whatever topic you're looking at, and really to look at the meanings that people assign to their work and to their lives. Now, from COPE-1, it became very, very clear that both people who are marginalized, especially kind of socioeconomically marginalized, providing effective treatment for chronic pain for them is much more complicated, much more difficult, and also their ability to live well with pain is really complicated by their circumstances. So this gave rise to COPE-2, which was titled An Institutional Ethnography of Mental Health Addictions and Poverty in the Lives of People with Chronic Pain. So again, we did not set out to look at sex and gender specifically from the outset in this study either, but it was honed in very much more on the experiences of people with marginalization and pain. So as an institutional ethnography is a form of ethnography that really looks at environments that are heavily mediated by text and policy, And it focuses on the work that people do in managing lives that are, in this case, beset by chronic pain and marginalization. And the definition of work here goes much beyond paid labor to kind of encompass everything that a person has to do in order to get by, to navigate a system, that kind of thing. So the data for this study consisted of 23 in-depth interviews with people living with chronic pain who also experienced marginalization. And these interviews were collected in, well, the people live in BC, Alberta, and Ontario, but they were all collected virtually because this took place during the COVID-19 pandemic. And all of those interviews were collected by Laura Canoy, who's a current postdoc on this study, and I believe she is here today. So that's a background on the data that I'm going to be talking about. Now, a bit about sex, gender, and pain. Data shows sex differences in pain, and I'm talking about kind of biological differences between female bodies, male bodies, and intersex bodies. But there's less literature on gender and pain. There's quite a bit of literature on masculinity and pain that tends to focus kind of in two areas, either the intersection of masculinity, pain, and work. So situations where you have like a man who works in a typically manual labor profession like trucking or building, and they're injured on the job. They have chronic pain following that injury. They're no longer able to be a provider for their family, and their sense of self and masculinity is very much wrapped up in both their work and their provider status, that kind of thing. Or at the intersection of pain, masculinity, and sports. But literature on women, which is what I'm going to be talking about today, and I'm not going to be talking about gender minorities, so I'm glad that that's already been well covered, there's actually a bit less literature at the moment on women and pain. But we do know that women are overrepresented among those with pain conditions that are poorly understood and more difficult to diagnose and treat. So I referred, for example, to the man who is injured on the job, has a back injury following a definitive event. And this is easier for many healthcare providers to understand than something like fibromyalgia, which affects many more women than men and takes often a much longer and more convoluted trajectory before a person gets to diagnosis, let alone any kind of effective treatment. And we also know that women are more likely to be prescribed anti-anxiety medications to cope with pain, and to be prescribed lower doses of analgesics like opioids, even when accounting for weight differences. So there's a bit of a paradox connected to gender and pain, where women are actually diagnosed with pain conditions more often, and it's more socially acceptable in general for women to display and convey pain and suffering, but their accounts of pain are less often believed than those of men. So the crux of what me and my team are trying to say here is chronic pain is a gendered experience. And we saw that in the previous presentation as well, informed by inequalities and stereotypes that have to be contextualized within the socially expected sets of behaviors, norms, and roles that being a person, in this case a woman, entails. And these, of course, intersect with other identities like race, like socioeconomic class, all kinds of things. And of course, comparable research could be done with respect to other genders. So today, from here, the rest of the presentation, really, I'm going to be talking about, first of all, our team-based secondary analysis of COPE2 data. So we went back and looked at it with an eye to gender specifically, and my own kind of critical reflection and analysis of all the COPE study data, both COPE1 and COPE2. And while gender wasn't initially the focus of any of this, it is central to my research program more broadly. So what have we found? Being a qualitative study, these are sort of organized into themes. The first is women's experiences of pain tend to reflect gendered pain conditions, which I referred to before, things like fibromyalgia, which are poorly understood and difficult to treat. So as this woman in her 30s said, the majority of the doctors that I've gone through have been unhelpful and hurtful. Not every doctor believes in fibromyalgia, and not every doctor has the training to recognize certain symptoms of certain diseases and disorders. So I've had to go through a large quantity of different doctors, not only because I didn't have a family doctor right away, but because there are doctors that just would see me as this overweight girl complaining. And this is one of the long ones that I have to apologize for. But we've also found that women with chronic pain live their pain while fulfilling a lot of very gendered care responsibilities, for instance, for children, for elder care. So this is actually a heavily abridged version of this quote. It really went on and on and on with a very long discussion of a huge amount of responsibility that this woman lives with. So she said, so yeah, my daughter, she has 2 young children. Last fall, she left her husband. And so her and the kids ended up here. My daughter moved in around the same time, pretty much, that I left the job because of her pain. She moved into my house. So I was not in a good state emotionally or physically. And because she wasn't in a good place emotionally, I ended up taking care of the children, even though I wasn't in a good place. And I'm still doing it. My son has issues as well. He's got ADHD and pretty bad anxiety. So he's had a really rough year at school. So it's just been a lot on me, both of them with their mental health issues, me with my mental health issues and my pain issues. And then he just recently had ACL surgery on his knee. That was last Friday. So now he's like, he needs even more of my attention. I just always seem to be taking care of other people. And I would argue that this is a different kind of gendered care work. It's kind of the gendered emotional labor of managing the lives of people who are affected by your pain. So as this woman said, I do have a husband, but unfortunately my husband, when I say I'm in pain, he actually kind of feels that he's in pain because he doesn't like to see me in pain, if that makes any sense. So I can't really rely on my husband because I don't want to get him upset. I have to rely on myself. And I have to like meditate, and it's usually just me dealing with my pain. I have no support system. We've also found, now keeping in mind that COPE2 focused on people who are living both pain and marginalization, a lot of gender-based violence, people with a long history of gender-based violence that's bound up, and that trauma is bound up in the pain they feel and also how they're able to manage it. So one woman said, I was in an abusive relationship, which didn't help anything. I finally got rid of him and I got the kids, and we were struggling the whole time. I was trying to work and I had 3 children that were all classified as special needs. There were more behavior problems than anything else, but yeah, my whole life's been a struggle. And I was separated 2 years ago. I was in a very abusive marriage for 26 years, but my ex-husband earned a very good wage, so I could afford most of my treatments. Since we separated, he provides very minimal support, and he's trying to ruin that. So I basically can't afford the management plan my doctors set up for me. And finally, we have found that a lot of these women are living with intergenerational poverty. They grew up in hard environments themselves. As this woman said, financially, it's always been a pretty significant struggle just to get by a bit and pay the bills. I also grew up in a more of a lower income neighborhood. My parents were definitely lower income individuals. So we've always sort of had a bit of a money struggle and had to make a lot of hard decisions that way. And I'm almost done here with the data, but the point that I really want to make is almost every narrative we've collected, these, although we've grouped them into separate themes, they compound one another, and people live almost always many of these different gendered experiences of pain at once. They're rarely mutually exclusive. Meaning that it actually addressing this with a gendered lens entails engaging with these multiple axes at the same time. So this example that I'm providing here, it's from the COPE1 study, and it was in response to me asking a counselor at a family medicine clinic that provides team-based care for pain, can you give me an example of a chronic pain patient that you consider complex? I didn't ask anything about gender, but the example that she gives really illustrates the way that this woman's pain is deeply gendered. So she says, the first person who comes to mind, however, medically speaking, she's not so complex, is a young lady who's had a complex trauma history, a lot of significant sexual abuse and physical abuse repeated cumulative across her early childhood into adolescence. She has chronic suicide in her family. She has also grown up in a situation where she's a caregiver for complex disability, family members that have osteogenesis imperfecta. So some real specialization around the family care and the family system. That was pretty complex and unique. And finally, the very last one, I just find this one, and this is again heavily abridged, this woman's narrative went on and on and on. It really illustrates kind of cumulatively what I'm trying to get at here. So she said, I am 61 years old. I have 2 children, one is deceased. She was born with microencephaly and epilepsy and CP, and she lived to be just short of her 15th birthday. I was 17 when I had her. I grew up really fast. I was sexually assaulted by a family member when I was about 8, 9, and 10, and suffered with depression since my early teens, more severe after my daughter was born. I've been on and off medication, been in counseling all along. They are thinking I have fibromyalgia. I have osteoarthritis in a number of parts of my body. I have bladder incontinence, irritable bowel syndrome, post-traumatic stress disorder, and bulging discs, back problems, wrist problems, hip problems. My son is through adoption and we have mega problems with him. He is obsessive compulsive, obsessive defiant, and ADD. He also has a severe substance abuse problem. He has 2 children, one in Winnipeg that's 14 and a daughter here that is 5. The mother also has a drug problem, so a lot of responsibility also falls back on our shoulders, and I find it very tiring. So I think it's pretty clear from what I've presented here that women's experiences of chronic pain are heavily shaped by their gender and the responsibilities and relationships that are connected to this. And we're at a pretty preliminary stage of our analysis with this data, so I would really warmly welcome any thoughts or insights that the team has on this. But one thing that I will say at this stage is it's pretty clear that addressing these challenges falls largely outside the scope of biomedicine. And I've chatted with a lot of biomedical colleagues about this and how hard they find it to know what to do when they're faced with patients like these. But not only does this fall outside the scope of biomedicine, it also falls largely outside the scope of policy intervention generally, or else it spans so many different domains of intervention, from domestic violence prevention to housing policy to food security, that it's very difficult to know what the initial steps would look like to address these gendered dimensions of chronic pain, so that women with pain can live better lives. So the recommendations that I have here are pretty preliminary, but first I would say at the level of medical training, we definitely need better medical education around complex pain conditions, especially ones like fibromyalgia, which disproportionately affect women and which don't have a very straightforward trajectory when it comes to diagnosis. But we also need better medical education around the gender biases that healthcare providers can hold, which make that process more complicated than it needs to be. These issues around having less belief in women's pain, for example. And we also, I think it's pretty clear, need better medical education, but also better research on the link between pain and trauma. That's something that we as a team have talked about a lot. We also need better or more resources for domestic violence prevention, shelters, things like that. But the piece that I'm really still grappling with myself is what to do about the kind of gendered caregiving relational aspects of this, because obviously the solution is not like to take children away from their parents and put them in the foster care system so the parents are no longer responsible for them. All of the people we talk to, I think they want to fulfill the caregiving responsibilities they have. They just really struggle to cope with it. So I think we need to do a whole lot more thinking around how to better support women with pain who have these kinds of responsibilities so that they can do it in a way that also allows room for self-care. So here's a few references and a few more and some citations of the research from these COPE studies that we have published. Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much. I would welcome questions.